The transition from daylight to the absolute darkness of the pre-electric era was a profound and inescapable shift in the human experience that redefined the boundaries of the known world. As the sun dipped below the western edge of the earth, the vibrant colors of the day would slowly bleed into shades of deep violet and indigo, while the shadows stretched across the landscape like silent giants. This transition was not merely a change in lighting, but a fundamental shift in the rhythm of existence for every living being on the planet. The absence of artificial illumination meant that the darkness possessed a physical weight and a presence that modern humanity has largely forgotten in the age of constant brilliance. In the pre-electric era, the night was a vast and mysterious territory where the familiar shapes of trees and hills dissolved into haunting silhouettes against the backdrop of infinite stars that seemed to descend toward the earth. Without the glow of city lights, the celestial canopy was a brilliant tapestry of silver and white that stretched from one horizon to the other, providing the only natural guidance for those who dared to move through the shadows of the wilderness. The world became significantly smaller as the light faded and the immediate environment of the home transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and dim visibility amid the encroaching gloom. Inside the dwellings of the past, the only defense against the absolute dark was the flickering flame of a hearth or the steady but fragile light of a single tallow candle that struggled to push back the shadows. This limited circle of light dictated the extent of human activity and forced a level of intimacy and stillness that defined the evening hours for centuries. The edges of the rooms would remain lost in deep shadows, where the textures of wood and stone seemed to shift and dance in the orange glow of the fire, while the rest of the house stayed cold and silent. Outside, the silence was profound and heavy, broken only by the natural sounds of the wind through the leaves or the distant call of a nocturnal bird searching for its prey in the blue mist. The absence of the constant hum of machines and the glare of street lamps allowed the human senses to sharpen and adapt to the subtle nuances of the dark world. People learned to navigate by the feel of the ground beneath their feet and the faint reflections of moonlight on the surface of the water or the dew on the grass. The arrival of the night was a signal for the mind to slow down and for the body to seek rest in harmony with the celestial cycles that governed all life. There was no pressure to remain productive or connected to the outside world once the darkness had fallen over the rooftops. Instead, the long hours of the night were a time for deep reflection and for the quiet sharing of stories that had been passed down through generations by word of mouth. The darkness was not something to be conquered, but a natural state of being that was respected and understood as an essential part of the human journey. In this world, the moon was the primary architect of the evening landscape, and its phases dictated the possibilities of travel and social gathering for entire communities. A full moon brought a silver clarity to the fields and forests, while the new moon wrapped the earth in a velvet cloak of total obscurity that demanded stay at home. Every shadow held a potential story, and every flicker of light was a precious resource to be used with care and gratitude. This ancient relationship with the night created a sense of wonder and humility that has been obscured by the constant brilliance of the modern age and its artificial day. The pre-electric night was a place of profound peace where the boundaries between the self and the universe seemed to blur in the quietude of the shadows and the cool air. As the temperature dropped and the world settled into its nocturnal slumber, the human spirit found a unique kind of solace in the vast and silent dark that offered a respite from the labors of the day. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, while the visual world was reduced to the immediate and the essential. This was the reality of the night for the vast majority of human history, a time of quietude and deep connection to the natural order of the cosmos. The blue hour was not just a fleeting moment, but the gateway into a long and silent realm that lasted until the first light of dawn broke the horizon. It was a time when the world belonged to the stars and the moon, and humans were merely silent observers of the celestial dance above their heads. The density of the dark was a blanket that offered protection and seclusion for the weary mind. The rhythm of sleep in the medieval world was governed not by mechanical clocks or artificial demands, but by the profound and inescapable cycles of the sun and the natural needs of the human form. Unlike the modern habit of attempting a single, unbroken block of rest, the people of this vast, shadowed era typically experienced their sleep in two distinct and meaningful phases. This natural structure of rest offered a unique connection to the deeper rhythms of the universe. The first sleep, or premier sommeil, would commence shortly after the last vestiges of twilight disappeared from the western sky, as the heavy blanket of nocturnal stillness descended upon the rural landscapes and walled cities alike. Exhausted by the physical demands of labor in the fields or the workshops, families would gather within their humble dwellings, warming themselves by the final glowing embers of the hearth fire before retiring to their communal beds of straw and rough woolen blankets. This initial phase of rest was heavy and swift, a profound surrender to the fatigue that accompanied a life in harmony with the agricultural calendar. For 4 or 5 consecutive hours, a deep silence would reign over the homes and the sleeping communities, broken only by the crackling of the fire or the distant, melancholic hoot of a nocturnal owl patrolling the darkness. Around midnight, or slightly later depending on the season and the individual, a gentle, collective awakening would occur throughout the land. This was not an abrupt interruption or a sign of insomnia, but a widely accepted natural interval known as the watch or the middle wake. During this serene gap, lasting perhaps an hour or two, the world remained suspended in the velvety absolute dark, yet the interior of the household became a small sanctuary of waking consciousness. Men and women would rise quietly from their beds, tending the failing fire with fresh wood to bring a subtle warmth and a soft flickering orange glow to the wooden beams and stone walls of their homes. And by the delicate, fragile light of a single tallow candle, they would engage in quiet activities. This was a precious time for intimate conversations fribbled in whispers, for the reciting of prayers for protection and guidance, or for deep, solitary meditation on the events of the day and the mysteries of the cosmos. Philosophers and theologians often found their greatest inspirations during these silent hours, believing the mind was closest to the divine when the busy noises of the world were stilled. Then, as the initial energy of the middle wake faded and the body naturally prepared itself once more for rest, they would ease themselves back under the covers for the second sleep. This second and final phase of resting would last until the very first gray light of the dawn began to pierce the eastern horizon, signaling the return to the waking world of labor and light. The dreams encountered during this second sleep were often considered to be more potent, vivid, and reflective of the thoughts and prayers uttered during the quiet of the midnight watch, offering a spiritual continuity to the daily life. This organic, segmented rhythm of sleep allowed for a deeper mental processing and a slow, deliberate relationship with time itself that has been almost entirely eclipsed by the relentless brilliance and artificial structuring of the modern industrial age. The history of human illumination is deeply intertwined with the evolution of the candle, a simple yet vital tool that served as the primary defense against the encroaching shadows of the pre-electric night for thousands of years. The most common form of light for the average household was the tallow candle, which was crafted through a laborious process of melting down animal fats, typically from cattle or sheep. This rendered fat, known as tallow, was then poured into molds or used for dipping wicks made of twisted cotton or flax. These tallow candles were far from perfect, as they produced a dim, yellowish light and emitted a distinct, heavy odor of cooking fat that would permeate the small, enclosed rooms of a cottage. They also had a tendency to smoke heavily and required constant maintenance known as snuffing, which involved trimming the charred end of the wick to prevent the flame from becoming too large and smoky. For the wealthy and the clergy, the experience of the night was vastly different because they could afford the luxury of beeswax candles, Beeswax was a superior material that burned more cleanly, lasted longer, and released a pleasant, honey-like fragrance into the air. Unlike tallow, beeswax did not require frequent wick trimming and provided a brighter, more consistent white light that allowed for more complex evening activities like reading or fine needlework. The disparity between these two types of light created a visual hierarchy within society, where the clarity of one's evening was often a direct reflection of their economic status. A single candle, regardless of its material, was a precious resource that was never used wastefully. Families would gather closely around a single flame to share its limited radiance, creating a tight-knit circle of warmth and visibility, while the rest of the room remained swallowed by a velvety, impenetrable darkness. The cost of candles was a significant part of a household's budget, leading many to rely on even humbler sources of light, such as rushlights, which were made by dipping the dried pith of a rush plant into leftover cooking grease. These rushlights provided a flickering, ephemeral glow that would only last for a few minutes, demanding a constant cycle of replacement throughout the evening. The ritual of lighting the first candle of the night was a moment of profound transition, signaling the official end of the working day and the beginning of the quiet, introspective hours of the home. The flame was a living thing, susceptible to every draft and movement of air, causing shadows to stretch and shrink across the walls in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic dance. This dancing light gave the interior of the home a dynamic, ever-changing quality that modern artificial lighting has completely eliminated. In the silence of the night, the soft sizzle of the melting wax and the occasional pop of the wick were the only sounds to accompany the thoughts of those sitting in the glow. The limited reach of the candlelight forced the focus on the immediate and the essential, encouraging a sense of presence and mindfulness that is often lost in the overstimulated modern world. The preservation of light was also a matter of safety, as an unattended flame could easily lead to a devastating fire in a world built of wood and thatch. The management of the candle was a task of great responsibility, often overseen by the head of the household. As the candle burned down toward its base, it served as a natural clock, measuring the passage of the night and the approach of the second sleep. The eventual extinguishing of the flame marked the final surrender to the absolute darkness, leaving the inhabitants to rely on their other senses and their intimate knowledge of their surroundings. This intimate relationship with a singular, fragile source of light fostered a deep appreciation for the sun's return and a profound respect for the power of the dark. The candle was not just a tool but a companion through the long, silent hours of history, shaping the way people thought, interacted, and perceived the world around them in the centuries before the first light bulb flickered into existence. Its gentle radiance was a bridge between the wild, untamed night and the safety of the human hearth. The visual experience of a candlelit room was one of depth and texture, where the play of light highlighted the grain of the wood and the weave of the fabric in ways that flat, modern light cannot replicate. This era of light was defined by its limitations and its beauty, a time when every flicker mattered, and the darkness was a constant, respected neighbor. The flickering candle stood as a testament to human resilience, a small but steady defiance against the void of the night, until the morning light finally reclaimed the world once more. As the 18th century drew to its daily close and the natural light faded from the sky, the domestic sphere became the center of a meticulous and essential ritual known as the bedtime routine. This was an era defined by the absolute necessity of preparing for the enveloping darkness that dominated the night, a time when securing the home and managing fire were paramount concerns for survival and comfort. The routine began not in the bedroom but at the heart of the home. The master or mistress of the house would assume the critical responsibility of banking the fire, a process of carefully covering the remaining hot embers with ash to preserve them for the morning light, This ensured that a new fire could be quickly coaxed back to life at dawn without the laborious use of tinderboxes, while also minimizing the terrifying risk of an unattended blaze spreading through the dwelling during the silent hours. Simultaneously, another member of the household would perform the rounds, ensuring that heavy wooden shutters were closed and securely bolted against the cold night air and potential intruders. The front door was locked with massive iron keys, the metallic click echoing through the widening silence of the settling house. As the downstairs was secured, attention turned to the bedchambers, which in the 18th century were often frigid and damp environments. To combat the bone-deep chill of the sheets, a warming pan, a long-handled brass or copper pan filled with hot coals taken directly from the kitchen fire, was employed. This device was slid between the heavy linen sheets of the four-poster beds, moving rhythmically up and down to chase away the dampness and create a brief, cherished pocket of warmth before the occupants retired. The actual process of undressing was performed quickly in the dim, shifting light of a single tallow or beeswax candle. Men donned long linen nightshirts and nightcaps intended to preserve body heat in the unheated rooms, while women layering themselves in chemises and perhaps woolen petticoats. The final act before seeking repose was often a solitary or family prayer, spoken in hushed tones into the vast quiet that pressed against the chamber walls, a plea for protection through the long, defenseless hours of the dark. Then, with a practiced breath, the singular candle would be extinguished, its small flame vanishing in a wisp of grey smoke, leaving the room surrendered entirely to the velvety, absolute blackness of the pre-electric night. This 18th century routine was a testament to the structured coexistence with the natural forces of darkness and cold, a rhythm of closure that modern life with its instant light and heat has largely forgotten. The sounds of the routine, the scraping of ashes, the bolting of doors, the hiss of the warming pan, and the soft breath extinguishing the light, formed the familiar lullaby of an era ruled by the sun. The urban landscape of the ancient world underwent a startling transformation the moment the sun disappeared beneath the horizon. In great centers like Rome, London, or Paris, the absence of street lighting meant that the city became a dense and impenetrable labyrinth of stone and timber, swallowed by an absolute and heavy darkness. Moving through the streets after twilight was an exercise in sensory adaptation and extreme caution, for the narrow alleys and winding lanes were often so constricted that even the light of a full moon could not reach the cobbles below. The soaring height of the buildings, constructed with jetted upper floors that reached toward one another across the streets, created a permanent canopy that excluded the stars and trapped the sense of the day. The air within these pitch-black corridors was thick with the smell of wood smoke from dying hearths, damp earth, and the lingering aroma of the marketplace. For the urban dweller, the night was not merely a time of rest, but a period of profound isolation within a crowded space. Every doorway became a deep pocket of shadow where the eye could find no purchase, and the familiar landmarks of the day dissolved into ghostly shapes that defied recognition. Those few who were forced to traverse the city at night often carried small lanterns or torches, but the reach of their light was meager, illuminating only a few feet of the uneven ground and casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to leap and dance against the shuttered windows. The soundscape of the dark city was equally striking, as the constant roar of commerce and conversation was replaced by a silence so profound it felt physical. The only breaks in this quiet were the rhythmic footsteps of the night watchmen echoing against the stone walls, the distant, muffled sound of a bell marking the hours, or the occasional scurrying of nocturnal animals through the waste. Social life within the city walls effectively ceased with the setting sun. As the heavy gates of the city were bolted shut and the residents withdrew behind thick oak doors and iron latches, This withdrawal was a matter of safety and tradition, as the darkness was seen as a realm where the laws of the day did not apply and where the boundaries of the known world were blurred. The psychology of the city at night was one of deep introspection and communal silence. Families huddled together in the upper rooms, their lives illuminated only by the faint glow of a single candle or the dying embers of a fire, while the streets below remained the territory of the shadows. There was a distinct beauty in this urban void, a time when the city could breathe and settle without the frantic energy of the sun. The textures of the stone, the grain of the wood, and the cold touch of iron railings became the primary ways of interacting with the environment. This era of total nocturnal darkness fostered a unique relationship between the citizen and the city, where the geography of the home was known by touch, and the geography of the street was a place of mystery to be avoided until the first light of dawn. The transition to early street lighting was centuries away, leaving generations of city dwellers to navigate their lives in harmony with the absolute blackness. Every shadow held a silence that modern humanity can scarcely imagine, a silence that allowed for a different kind of dreaming and a deeper connection to the slow, steady heartbeat of the ancient world. The city was not a place of light but a place of stone waiting for the return of the sun, where the vastness of the universe was felt in the cool, quiet air of the narrowest alley. As the night deepened, the city became a monument to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the unknown, a silent witness to the passage of time under a canopy of velvet darkness that stretched from the chimney pots to the furthest stars. The coldness of the stone walls would seep into the air, creating a crispness that made every breath visible in the dim light. The absence of the constant hum of machines allowed the ears to detect the smallest sounds, the creak of a wooden sign swinging in the breeze, the drip of water from a hidden gutter, or the faint murmur of a neighbor's prayer from behind a thick wall. Life was stripped down to its most essential elements: heat, shelter, and the company of others. The density of the dark was so great that it seemed to flatten the three-dimensional world into a series of overlapping planes of gray and black. It was a time of true stillness, where the mind could wander as far as the stars while the body remained anchored in the safety of the hearth. This was the urban night for thousands of years, a world of shadows and secrets where the light of a single candle was a beacon of hope against the vast, encroaching silence of the stone city. Even the grandest palaces were reduced to silhouettes, their towers reaching up like dark fingers to touch the cold, indifferent moon. The streets were not roads but canyons of silence, where time itself seemed to slow down and wait for the inevitable, glorious return of the morning light. Before the advent of artificial illumination, the moon was not merely a distant celestial body but the primary regulator of nocturnal life, and the sole provider of navigation in the pre-electric world. Human communities for thousands of years synchronized their activities with the reliable and visible cycles of the lunar phases. Living by moonlight meant that the brightness of the night sky dictated the possibilities of human movement and social interaction after sunset. A full moon was a significant and cherished event, bringing a brilliant, almost pearlescent clarity to the fields, forests, and village paths. During these brief nights of lunar abundance, the darkness was pushed back sufficiently to allow for extended labor, particularly during critical agricultural seasons when farmers would harvest crops deep into the night, guided only by the soft, cool glow of the harvest moon or the hunter's moon. These were also the preferred times for travel between settlements, as the landscape lay illuminated and the dangers of the road were reduced by the ambient light reflecting off the earth and water. The full moon also became the natural catalyst for social gatherings, market nights, and communal celebrations, as people knew they could safely navigate the familiar terrain and return home without getting lost in the shadows. Conversely, The period around the new moon represented a time of deep, velvety obstruction, when the nocturnal world retreated into a profound and silent isolation. These were the dark nights of folk tradition, when the absence of the lunar protector left the wilderness to the domain of the unseen and the imagined. During the new moon, long-distance travel was almost entirely suspended, and individuals rarely ventured far from the immediate vicinity of their homes or campfire circles. The rhythm of life slowed even further during these dark phases, fostering introspection and a heavy reliance on oral storytelling around the indoor hearth. The moon was effectively the natural clock of the evening, measuring the passage of time across the sky and through the months. Entire calendars and religious festivals were calculated based on the arrival of the crescent or the waning of the orb, ensuring that the community remained in harmony with the celestial order. People possessed an intimate and detailed knowledge of the moon's behavior, observing its rising and setting times, its angle in the sky, and the distinct qualities of light it cast across the landscape. A half-moon offered a different perspective, creating stark contrasts and defining textures that are often blurred by modern lighting. While a faint crescent promised the return of luminosity, the reflection of moonlight on moving water, on a calm pond, or on a frost-covered meadow created a dynamic, almost hypnotic beauty that shaped the aesthetic perception of the night. This disconnection to the lunar cycle fostered a sense of humility and interdependence with the natural world, a recognition that human agency was often bounded by forces beyond our control. A misty night under a hidden moon felt heavy and closed in, while a crisp, clear winter night under a prominent moon felt expansive and bright. This living relationship with the lunar oracle ensured that time itself was perceived as a cyclical and patient flow rather than the precise artificial segmentation of hours and minutes that defines our modern existence. The moon was the silent guardian, the calendar of the night, and the faithful companion of humanity through the long, pre-electric centuries. The steady and viscous glow of the oil lamp served as a vital anchor for human activity during the long and silent centuries that preceded the invention of the electric light bulb. These vessels of light, crafted from humble clay, polished bronze, or ornate brass, were the primary means by which humanity pushed back the boundaries of the nocturnal world for thousands of years. The fundamental mechanics of the oil lamp relied on the elegant principles of capillary action, where a fibrous wick made of twisted cotton, linen, or rush pit would draw liquid fuel from a central reservoir to sustain a small and persistent flame. The fuel itself was a direct reflection of the geography and resources available to the community in the sun-drenched regions of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The clear and fragrant oil of the olive was the preferred choice, providing a relatively clean burning and reliable source of light that smelled faintly of the harvests in the coastal regions of the north. The heavy and pungent oils rendered from fish or the massive leviathans of the deep sea, whales, became the essential liquid that fueled the night. The experience of an oil-lit room was one of profound intimacy and sharp contrast, as the lamp produced a soft, warm pool of amber light that struggled to penetrate the vast and heavy shadows that occupied the rest of the chamber. These shadows were not static, but seemed to breathe and shift with every minor draft that entered the house, creating a dynamic and living environment where the textures of wood, stone, and fabric were highlighted in ways that modern, flat lighting can never replicate. The olfactory atmosphere was equally distinct, as the burning oil released a characteristic scent of warm fat and carbon that lingered in the still air, slowly depositing a fine layer of soot on the ceilings and beams over many years of use. For the scholar, the monk, and the artisan, the oil lamp was the silent witness to the most focused and solitary hours of human labor. The phrase "burning the midnight oil" originated from this very reality, where the exhaustion of the fuel reservoir served as a natural measure of time and dedication in the quietude of the late hours. The light of an oil lamp was considerably more stable and enduring than the erratic, flickering flame of a tallow candle, allowing for the slow and meticulous work of transcribing manuscripts, sewing fine garments, or studying the movements of the stars through a small window. Maintenance of the lamp was a rhythmic and essential domestic duty, requiring the constant trimming of the charred wick to prevent smoke and the careful monitoring of the oil level to ensure the flame did not suddenly die. The arrival of the glass chimney in the late 18th century, particularly with the invention of the argon lamp, revolutionized the quality of this light by providing a steady airflow that increased the brightness and reduced the flicker. These glass cylinders would often become frosted with a delicate layer of mist or heat, refracting the light into a soft, crystalline glow that filled the immediate vicinity with a sense of calm and sanctuary. As the oil burned down toward the bottom of the vessel, the flame would begin to pulse and dance, serving as a gentle, natural signal that the time for the second sleep had arrived, and that the world must be surrendered once more to the absolute darkness. The final act of the evening was often the extinguishing of the lamp, which brought an immediate and total transition to the heavy, silent blackness of the pre-electric world, leaving only the lingering warmth of the lamp and the faint smell of the cooling oil as the last memories of the light. This slow and deliberate relationship with a liquid-fueled flame fostered a deep sense of presence and a profound respect for the precious nature of illumination, shaping the very way humans perceive their homes, their history, and the vast, indigo mystery of the universe that waited just beyond the reach of the wick. In the dense and silent urban centers of the pre-electric world, the figure of the night watchman was a constant and rhythmic presence that defined the nocturnal soundscape of the ancient city. As the heavy iron gates of the town were bolted shut, and the residents retreated behind the thick timber and stone of their homes, the watchman began his solitary journey through the labyrinth of narrow alleys and winding cobblestone paths. His primary duty was to maintain a vigilant guard over the sleeping community, serving as both a protector against the ever-present threat of fire and a quiet deterrent to any who would disturb the peace of the absolute dark. The watchman moved with a slow and deliberate pace, his heavy leather boots creating a steady, echoing cadence that bounced off the cold stone walls and served as a comforting reminder to the inhabitants that the night was being watched. He was often the only living soul moving through the deep blue mist that settled in the low-lying parts of the city, his breath visible in the crisp, damp air as he navigated the pitch-black corridors. The most iconic tool of his trade was the heavy horn lantern, which cast a weak, yellowish glow that barely penetrated the vast shadows of the overhanging buildings. This lantern was not intended to fully illuminate the path, but rather to signal his presence and to allow him to inspect the locks and seals on the warehouse doors and private residences. The flickering light created long, erratic shadows that danced across the uneven ground, making the familiar geography of the day seem strange, fluid, and mysterious in the dead of night. Alongside his lantern, the watchman often carried a heavy staff or a halberd and a bell or a rattle used to mark the passing of the hours or to sound an alarm in the event of an emergency. The rhythmic ring of the bell was a fundamental part of the medieval nocturnal experience, providing a sense of temporal order in a world where the sun was the only clock. He would frequently call out the hour and the state of the weather in a low, melodic voice, his words drifting through the still air and filtering through the shuttered windows of the sleeping families. His vocalizations were not merely announcements, but a form of social glue that connected the isolated households within the void of the darkness. The psychology of the night watchman was one of profound solitude and sensory adaptation. His ears became finely tuned to the smallest shifts in the environment. The distant creak of a swinging sign, the soft scurrying of a nocturnal animal, or the faint murmur of the wind through the eaves. He was the bridge between the day and the dawn. A human sentinel standing against the unpredictable nature of the dark, the physical environment he patrolled was one of extreme sensory deprivation, where the smell of damp stone, old wood smoke, and stagnant water defined the atmosphere. The absence of light allowed the Watchmen to develop an intimate knowledge of the city's textures, recognizing every protruding stone and every dip in the road by touch and sound alone. For the average citizen, the sound of the Watchman's footsteps was a lullaby of safety, a sign that the boundaries of the home were being respected and that the external world was under control. The role was often hereditary or passed down through long apprenticeships, ensuring that the secrets and the rhythms of the Night City were preserved across generations. There was a distinct dignity in this nocturnal labor, a quiet commitment to the welfare of others while the world was surrendered to the second sleep. As the watchman completed his rounds and the first grey light of the morning began to soften the edges of the horizon, his task was complete. His lantern was extinguished, and he would withdraw to his own rest as the city began its slow and noisy awakening. This ancient tradition of the night watch was a testament to the human need for order and security in the face of the unknown, a vital thread in the fabric of pre-electric life that provided a sense of continuity under the vast indifferent sky. The watchman did not just observe the darkness, he lived within it, becoming a part of the city's nocturnal soul. His presence was as much a part of the night as the moon and the stars, a steady and reliable rhythm that kept the silence from becoming too heavy or the dark from becoming too lonely. He walked through the history of the night, a shadow among shadows, keeping the flame of order alive until the sun returned. In the ancient urban landscape, the setting of the sun triggered a complex and rigid series of security protocols designed to protect the collective from the unpredictable nature of the absolute dark. As the long shadows of the evening merged into a single heavy veil of night, the city gates, constructed of massive oak and reinforced with bands of cold wrought iron, were swung shut by the combined effort of the gatekeepers. The sound of the heavy wooden beams sliding into place and the metallic click of enormous iron locks signaled the total isolation of the city from the surrounding wilderness. This physical closure was more than a mere defense against external enemies. It was a symbolic act that defined the boundary between the controlled world of the day and the lawless realm of the nocturnal. Once the main gates were secured, internal barriers within the city districts were also activated. Chains were often stretched across the narrowest streets and alleys to impede the movement of horses and to prevent any sudden, coordinated actions by groups of outlaws or rebels who might seek to exploit the cover of the darkness. These iron chains, cold to the touch and shrouded in blue mist, served as physical reminders of the city's commitment to internal order. The legal framework of the night was equally restrictive, with many ancient jurisdictions imposing strict curfew or couvre-feu regulations. The word itself, meaning cover the fire, instructed every household to extinguish or safely bank their hearth fires by a specific signal, often the ringing of a great bell from the central cathedral or town hall. This was a vital precaution in an era when most buildings were constructed of flammable timber and thatch, and a single stray spark could lead to the total destruction of an entire neighborhood in the silent hours. The vibration of the great bell would travel through the cold night air, shaking the very stone of the walls and resonating in the chests of the residents who hurried to complete their final chores. Any individual found on the streets after the curfew without a valid reason or a recognized lantern was viewed with extreme suspicion and could face immediate detention by the night guard. The responsibility for safety was also a communal burden, with neighbors expected to respond to the hue and cry if an intruder was detected. This system of mutual surveillance created a tight-knit, vigilant environment where every sound in the darkness was analyzed and evaluated by the ears of the sleeping. The locks and keys of the ancient world were remarkable works of early engineering, featuring intricate mechanisms designed to be operated in near total darkness by touch alone. These heavy iron keys, often carried on large rings by the patriarch of the house, represented the ultimate power over the domestic threshold. Inside the homes, the families would settle into the deep quiet of their inner chambers, relying on the strength of their stone walls and the security of their bolted shutters to provide a sanctuary against the perceived dangers of the pitch-black streets. The atmosphere of the locked-down city was one of profound stillness and a heavy, brooding caution, where the only movement was the rhythmic patrol of the watchman and the occasional flickering of a small, authorized lamp through a high window. The darkness acted as a natural barrier that flattened the social hierarchies of the day, reducing the grandest avenue and the humblest lane to the same state of impenetrable shadow. As the night deepened, the city became a fortress of silence, with every resident playing their part in the preservation of the collective peace. The psychological weight of this security was balanced by a deep sense of shared destiny and a profound respect for the power of the dark to hide and to reveal. The ancient city at night was not a place of freedom, but a place of disciplined survival, where the return of the sun was the only true signal that the dangers of the shadows had once again been held at bay. The return of light brought the release of the bolts and the reopening of the gates, a daily rebirth for the community that had successfully navigated the long, silent trial of the pre-electric night. The texture of the stone walls felt colder in the dark, and the smell of the damp river air would often rise to meet the scent of old wood, creating a sensory experience that was as much about what could be felt as what could be seen. Every creak of a floorboard and every rattle of a shutter was amplified by the vastness of the urban void, until the world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the first touch of gold on the horizon to break the spell of the indigo shadows. The preservation of the flame was not just a matter of light, but a matter of communal life. As the city slept under the watchful eye of the stars and the ironclad promise of the gatekeepers, far beyond the protective walls and intricate security protocols of the ancient cities, the pre-electric night in the rural landscape possessed a depth and character that was defined by a profound and expansive solitude. It was a darkness that modern humanity, accustomed to the constant presence of artificial light, can scarcely imagine, a velvety, total blackness that began at the very threshold of the humble farmhouses and cottages. When the sun surrendered the sky to the stars and the moon, the countryside settled into a rhythm that was dictated purely by the natural world. Inside the simple dwellings, constructed of stone or rough-hewn timber, the single hearth fire would be carefully banked with ash to preserve the heat until dawn, casting a faint, pulsing red glow across the wooden beams and dirt floors. Families would gather closely around this central warmth, their lives reduced to the immediate and the essential in the face of the encroaching gloom. But it was outside, beyond the heavy oak doors and bolted shutters, that the true essence of the rural night was found. It was never truly silent, but rather filled with a complex and delicate symphony of natural sounds that modern life has largely forgotten how to hear. This was the original acoustic therapy of the land, a comforting and meditative melody composed of the rhythmic rustling of leaves in the night wind, the distant, melancholic call of an owl patrolling the margins of the forest, and the persistent, almost vibrational drone of the crickets in the tall grass, a sound that seemed to mark the very passage of time itself. Sensory experience was heightened in this environment of visual deprivation, as the cool night air, often carrying the heavy scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and wild herbs, settled over the fields. People developed an intimate connection with the textures of their world, navigating paths by the feel of the ground beneath their feet and recognizing landmarks by their silhouette against the celestial canopy. and millions of stars filled that canopy from one horizon to the other, forming a dense, silver-colored tapestry that seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way was not a faint smear, but a blazing river of light that guided the thoughts and dreams of those watching below, connecting them to the vastness of the universe. For the farmer or laborer, the rural night was a time of true cessation, a period when the relentless demands of survival paused and surrendered to the quietude of the shadows. It was a time for oral storytelling, where myths and legends were passed down around the cooling hearth, their meanings woven into the very fabric of the darkness. This era of rural isolation fostered a deep sense of humility and interdependence with the natural order, a recognition that human activity was bounded by forces far greater than itself. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, a sense of profound peace and safety would settle over the homesteads, a feeling of being embraced by the natural world rather than struggling against it. The air felt clearer, the stars felt closer, and the long hours of the pre-electric night offered a sanctuary for reflection and rest that has been lost in the constant brilliance of the modern age. The tradition of sharing oral narratives in the deep, pre-electric night was far more than a simple pastime. It was a fundamental social and psychological necessity that allowed early human communities to process the vastness of the darkness and maintain their collective identity across generations. For thousands of years, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was surrendered to the indigo shadows, the hearth fire became the focal point of human existence, drawing the household together into a tight circle of warmth and limited visibility. In this intimate space, the spoken word was the only bridge between the physical reality of the home and the mysterious, infinite void that pressed against the walls. These nightly storytelling sessions served as the primary method for transmitting historical knowledge, moral codes, and practical wisdom in societies where written records were rare or non-existent. The elder members of the community often took on the role of the narrator, their voices becoming a rhythmic and grounding presence that offered comfort and continuity in the face of the unknown. The stories they told were not mere fictions, but were perceived as living truths that explained the origins of the world, the movements of the stars, and the complex relationship between humanity and the natural forces that governed their lives. As the fire crackled and the flames cast long, dancing shadows across the timber or stone interior, the listeners would fall into a meditative state, their imagination stimulated by the lack of visual detail in the dim light. This environment of visual deprivation was essential to the power of the oral tradition, as it forced the mind to create its own vivid images, transforming the simple domestic setting into a vast theater of the mind where the textures of the story could be felt almost physically. The themes of these narratives often reflected the seasonal cycles and the immediate environment of the tellers, weaving local landmarks and ancestral spirits into a grander cosmic tapestry. This practice also provided a crucial sense of security, as the familiar cadence of the storyteller's voice acted as a vocal shield against the perceived dangers of the nocturnal wilderness. The bedtime story was a ritual of transition, guiding the listeners from the high alert state of the day into the calm, receptive state required for the first sleep. The pace of the narration was slow and deliberate, matching the cooling of the air and the settling of the house as the night deepened. Every pause and whisper in the darkness carried a weight and meaning that is often lost in the constant noise of the modern world. The absence of artificial light ensured that the focus remained entirely on the sound of the voice and the shared presence of the group, fostering a deep sense of belonging and empathy. This tradition of nighttime narration was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a way of finding meaning and order within the chaos of the shadows. As the story reached its conclusion and the final embers of the fire began to fade into a dull red glow, a profound silence would return to the room, leaving the participants to carry the echoes of the narrative into their dreams, These stories were the threads that held the fabric of human culture together for millennia, providing a map through the long, silent hours of history and ensuring that the light of knowledge was never truly extinguished by the dark. It was a time of deep listening and profound connection. Where the boundaries between the self and the community seemed to blur in the quietude of the evening, the storytelling circle was the original classroom, the original theater, and the original sanctuary, a place where the human voice stood as a steady defiance against the absolute silence of the stars. And as each generation added its own layers to the ancestral tales, the night became not a source of fear, but a reservoir of wisdom and a canvas for the enduring power of the human imagination. The arrival of winter in the pre-electric world brought about a season of profound stasis, where the rhythm of life slowed to a patient, almost glacial pace in harmony with the freezing landscape outside. As the long, indigo shadows of the early evening merged into the absolute blackness of the night, the struggle against the creeping cold became the central organizing principle of the human dwelling. In these quiet centuries, the open hearth or the simple stove was not merely a feature of the home but its beating heart, the only barrier between the fragile spark of life and the indifferent, biting frost that pressed against the thick stone walls or timber frames. Fuel for these fires, usually seasoned hardwood, peat, or sometimes coal, was the most precious currency of the winter months, and its gathering, splitting, and storage was a laborious task that defined the warmer seasons. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped toward freezing, the physical experience of heating was one of local and variable comfort. A warm, crackling circle near the fire contrasted sharply with the frigid drafts that circulated through the uninsulated corners and upper chambers. To maximize efficiency and preserve heat, families would retreat to the smallest, most enclosed spaces, effectively hibernating within their own homes. The actual bedtime routine involved the critical task of banking the fire, where the master of the house would carefully cover the remaining hot embers with an insulating layer of ash. This technique prevented the wood from burning too quickly while ensuring that enough heat remained until dawn to allow for a swift, easy rekindling of the flames. A failure in banking meant facing a frigid awakening and the difficult use of tinder boxes in a pitch-black room. The sensory experience of winter heating created a unique and comforting nocturnal environment. The rich, smoky aroma of burning wood or peat would permeate every fiber of the clothing, bedding, and the very timber of the building, becoming the characteristic scent of the winter stasis. Visually, the light was restricted to the warm, rhythmic pulse of the glowing embers, casting soft, dynamic shadows that danced in silence across the low ceiling and the faces of those huddled together. Families often slept in communal beds, leveraging collective body heat under heavy woolen quilts, linen sheets, and sometimes even animal furs. To survive the sub-zero temperatures that sometimes froze water pitchers inside the rooms, larger households sometimes employed a fire watcher, whose sole nocturnal duty was to tend the various fires in the house, moving like a silent ghost through the cold corridors to add a fresh log or turn the coals, preserving the localized pockets of warmth. The absolute silence of a snow-covered night amplified the smallest sounds of the heating process. The subtle sizzle of sap in the log, the soft collapse of a charring ember, or the muffled roar of the wind in the chimney. These sounds formed the background lullaby of an era ruled by the seasons and the sun. Winter nights were a true ceasefire from labor, a time of forced, meditative rest where human communities waited in patient solidarity for the eventual return of the spring sun. A sense of shared vulnerability and quiet coziness was forged in these limited circles of warmth, creating a different perception of time, one that was measured not by clocks, but by the slow, gradual consumption of the fuel and the patient heartbeat of the banked fire. A profound stillness of mind accompanied this seasonal stasis, as the world outside was locked in ice and the world inside was held in the soft orange embrace of the ancient hearth. The practice of sleeping beneath the open sky, which modern society often reserves for recreational camping or views as a sign of hardship, was for millennia a routine and often necessary aspect of human existence during the pre-electric era. And the primary driver for this nocturnal migration from the safety of the indoor hearth was often the oppressive, unrelenting heat of summer, especially in warmer climates like the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and India. The thick mud brick or stone walls of traditional dwellings served as natural thermal batteries, absorbing the relentless sun all day and radiating stifling warmth long after sunset, making the interior chambers unbearably hot and still for restful sleep, and therefore, as the long, indigo shadows of twilight stretched across the landscape, families would often carry their simple bedrolls, consisting of woven mats, light woolen blankets, or simple linen sheets, up to the flat, open rooftops of their homes, and here, elevated above the heavy, dusty air of the streets below, they could find the cherished relief of a cool night breeze moving gently over the horizon. This rooftop sleeping was often a communal activity, with whole neighborhoods sharing the vast, star-filled canopy as their collective ceiling, fostering a unique sense of shared vulnerability and quiet solidarity that has been almost entirely erased by our modern, compartmentalized living, and for travelers moving along ancient trade routes, for merchants in caravans, or for shepherds guarding their valuable flocks from nocturnal predators. Sleeping outdoors was not a choice but a fundamental professional reality, and for these solitary observers of the dark, the experience was entirely immersive. Their beds were simple depressions in the dry earth, or crude shelters made of branches and rough canvas, and their relationship with the night was one of deep, alert connection. They learned to read the sky as a vital navigation tool, watching the constellations drift slowly from east to west, using the movements of the celestial clock to mark the hours of their watch and judge the coming of the dawn. The soundscape of this outdoor existence was dominated entirely by the rhythmic music of the natural world, the distant, melancholic howling of wolves or jackals, the soft rustling of tall grass in the wind, and the persistent, almost vibrational chirping of countless insects, all amplified by the surrounding stillness, and the olfactory experience was equally rich, composed of the scent of damp earth, drying wild herbs, night-blooming flowers, and perhaps the faint trace of a dying campfire drifting through the cool air. And while sleeping exposed to the elements brought a degree of physical discomfort and required a constant vigilance against sudden weather changes or insects, it also offered a profound psychological reward, a feeling of being embraced by the infinite expanse of the universe. And as the cool air calmed the mind and settled the body into a restorative repose, the boundaries between the self and the cosmos seemed to dissolve into a gentle, meditated stillness, until the very first gray light of dawn broke on the eastern horizon, signaling the time to return to the active life of the day. This ancient and widespread habit of embracing the raw beauty of the nocturnal world provided a vital connection to the cyclical rhythms of nature that artificial lighting has largely erased. It was a time of deep listening and profound peace under the eternal guardian of the stars. The act of composition, scholarship, and correspondence in the pre-electric era was a laborious and often solitary endeavor that required a patient surrender to the limitations of nocturnal light. For thousands of years, the transfer of thoughts onto parchment, vellum, or early paper was performed under the faint, unstable radiance of a single flame, creating a unique atmosphere of deep concentration and physical strain. As the sunset and the heavy silence of the night descended upon the medieval monastery or the early modern study, The writer would trim the wick of a candle or fill the reservoir of a simple oil lamp, preparing for a focused race against the encroaching darkness, the light source, whether a flickering tallow candle, a smoky rushlight, or a persistent oil lamp cast only a very small, concentrated circle of visibility onto the writing surface, leaving the corners of the room swallowed by a deep, velvety blackness. This visual deprivation fostered a profound mental intimacy with the text. As the outside world dissolved beyond the narrow cone of amber light, the scholar or scribe became acutely aware of the sensory textures of their craft. The scratch of the goose quill against the rough surface of the paper, the metallic scent of the iron gall ink drying on the page, and the rhythmic motion of dipping the nib back into the inkwell to replenish the flowing script, to maximize the meager illumination. Many writers employed specialized tools like glass spheres filled with water, which acted as rudimentary lenses to focus and amplify the candle's light onto a single paragraph or line. Others favored oil lamps made of polished brass or copper that provided a steadier, less erratic glow than the cheap candles available to the masses. But despite these aids, eye strain was an inevitable consequence of prolonged nocturnal labor, forcing the writer to pause frequently, staring into the comforting dark to rest the vision while the thoughts matured in the stillness. The silence of the night scriptorium was palpable, broken only by the crackle of the wax, the soft breath of the wind against the shutters, or the distant, melancholic call of a night watchman marking the hours. This environment favored a deliberate, methodical pace of composition, where every word was chosen with care before being committed to the precious material of the page. The lack of instantaneous revision meant that the writing process was a continuous flow of consciousness, captured in the dim, shifting shadows. The finished manuscript, marked by occasional drops of wax or the very texture of ink applied by an exhausted hand, stood as a testament to the patient resilience of the human intellect working in harmony with the natural cycles of light and rest. And when the candle finally burned down to its socket, or the oil reservoir ran dry, the worker would be forced to surrender to the second sleep, leaving the unfinished thought suspended in the deep, indigo quietude of the ancient room, until the first grey light of dawn returned to reclaim the world of visible ideas. The act of writing before electricity was a meditative dialogue with the self, conducted in the hallowed silence of a candlelit night. The concept of nocturnal labor in the pre-electric era was defined by a profound and intimate relationship with the elemental forces of heat, light, and silence as the heavy indigo veil of the night descended upon the landscape. The vast majority of human society surrendered to the natural rhythm of the first sleep, but for a select and essential few, the darkness was the primary theater of their professional existence. These ancient night shifts were not the result of a globalized economy, but were dictated by the physical properties of the materials they managed or the absolute necessity of communal safety. Among the most critical of these workers were the furnace and kiln tenders, whose lives were spent in a subterranean world of pulsing orange light and rhythmic heat. In the grand public baths of the Roman world or the early iron-smelting furnaces of the forest regions, these individuals performed a continuous, hypnotic labor. They were the guardians of the eternal flame, ensuring that the fires never dimmed during the cold, damp hours of the deep night. The furnace tender moved with a slow, measured cadence, his movements dictated by the needs of the fire, stoking the glowing coals with heavy iron rakes and feeding the hungry moles of the furnace with seasoned hardwood. The sensory experience of this work was one of extreme contrast, as the searing heat of the flames met the biting chill of the midnight air flowing through the ventilation shafts. The soundscape was a deep, vibrational hum of moving air and the metallic clatter of tools against stone. While the rest of the world was lost in silence, the furnace tender was surrounded by the living, breathing voice of the heat. His eyes were trained to read the subtle changes in the color of the embers, recognizing the precise moment to add fuel to maintain the steady warmth that heated the water for the morning bathers in the higher, more silent reaches of the town. The ancient astronomer and the celestial timekeeper began their own nocturnal vigil. Their labor was one of intense meditative observation and mathematical precision, working in the hallowed quietude of the dark, majestic procession of the stars across the velvet canopy. Their tools were astrolabes and clepsydras that measured the passage of time by the rhythmic drip of water. For these workers, the night was not a void but a dense map of information, and their role was to translate the movements of the cosmos into calendars for the community. They worked in near total darkness, their only light being the faint silver glow of the moon or the meager radiance of a shielded oil lamp that cast a tiny, focused circle onto their parchment. The scratch of the quill was the only sound in their scriptorium, a delicate and persistent rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the sleeping city below. Meanwhile, in the flour-dusted bakeries hidden within the narrow alleys, the day began at midnight. The baker's labor was a rhythmic cycle of kneading and stoking, performed in a world of white dust and golden warmth. The heavy wooden troughs were filled with dough that had been rising in the silence, and the baker worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands moving with the grace of long experience. The sound of the dough being slapped onto the flour table and the soft hiss of the brick oven were the only breaks in the nocturnal stillness. The baker was the herald of the morning, his work being the first tangible sign of the coming day as the aroma of baking bread drifted through the cool, blue mist of the streets, providing a sensory anchor for those waking for the second sleep. Another rare but vital night job was that of the charcoal burner, who lived in the remote margins of the wilderness. Their work was a continuous process that could not be interrupted, requiring them to stay awake through the long, indigo hours to monitor the evaporation or the slow smoldering of wood piles. They lived in simple, smoke-stained shelters, their lives revolving around the steady pulse of the fire and the shifting patterns of the wind. The night for them was a companion and a challenge, as they learned to read the sounds of the forest and the changes in the air to anticipate the weather. They were the masters of the slow transformation, their labor being a testament to the patient endurance required in a pre-electric world. The journey of artificial illumination across the vast expanse of human history began with the most primitive and raw form of controlled fire, known as the torch, which consisted of a simple branch or a bundle of resinous wood bound together and ignited to push back the boundaries of the absolute dark. For many millennia, these flickering and unstable sources of light were the only means by which humanity could traverse the nocturnal wilderness or navigate the damp, shadowy corridors of early stone dwellings. The torch was a living and erratic thing, producing a fierce and smoky flame that consumed its fuel with a relentless hunger, leaving a heavy trail of black soot on the ceilings and a pungent aroma of burning pine and fat in the still night air. It was a tool of necessity rather than comfort, requiring constant movement to keep the oxygen flowing to the flame and posing a significant fire risk in a world built almost entirely of wood and thatch. As human civilization advanced and the need for more portable and protected light sources grew, the invention of the lantern represented a monumental shift in the relationship between man and the night. The earliest lanterns were simple protective enclosures crafted from translucent materials like scraped and flattened animal horn, which were carefully processed until they became thin enough to allow light to pass through while remaining durable enough to withstand the heat. These were often called lanthorns in old traditions, and they were designed to shield a fragile candle or small oil lamp from the unpredictable drafts and winds of the outdoor environment. The word lantern itself evokes the image of a safe and steady beacon, a small sanctuary of light carried through the indigo mist of the ancient world. The transition from the raw, open flame of the torch to the enclosed and regulated light of the lantern allowed for a level of mobility and security that was previously impossible. It transformed the night from a realm of stationary hearths into a landscape that could be explored and managed with increasing confidence. The materials used in lantern construction evolved alongside the progress of metallurgy and glass blowing, moving from humble iron frames and horn panes to sophisticated brass or copper housings with clear glass cylinders that amplified the radiance of the internal flame. The sensory experience of carrying a lantern through a silent, pre-electric city or a rural path was one of rhythmic shadows and focused visibility, as the small, amber light created a moving circle of clarity that highlighted the texture of the cobblestones or the dampness of the earth, while the rest of the world remained lost in the deep blue void. The soft clatter of the metal frame and the subtle hiss of the burning wick became the characteristic sounds of the nocturnal traveler, marking their progress through the long, silent hours. The lantern also became a symbol of civil order and professional duty, carried by the night watchman, the sailor, and the gatekeeper to signal their presence and their authority in the face of the unknown. It was a bridge between the wild, untamed fire of the past and the sophisticated lighting systems of the future, a testament to human ingenuity and the persistent desire to find safety and meaning in the darkness. Every lantern held a story of survival and the commitment to the preservation of light against the vast, encroaching silence of the stars, and as the technology of the lantern refined, it paved the way for the early street lighting systems that would eventually lead to the end of the absolute dark. Yet even in its most advanced form, the lantern remained a humble and intimate tool, a companion for the solitary mind, and a guardian for the weary traveler in the hallowed quietude of the ancient night. The evolution from the smoky, resinous torch to the elegant, glass-enclosed lantern reflected the broader journey of the human spirit, moving from a state of raw survival toward a more deliberate and aesthetic engagement with the world of shadows. In the silence of the night, the steady glow of the lantern offered a sense of continuity, a way to hold on to the light even when the sun was far below the horizon. And as the traveler moved through the mist, the lantern felt like a piece of the sun held in the hand, a warm and reliable friend in a world of cold indigo and deep navy. The texture of the horn or the glass became a filter for the world, softening the harsh edges of the darkness and creating a space for peace and reflection. It allowed for the slow and careful reading of maps, the quiet inspection of cargo, and the gentle lighting of a pathway home. The transition was complete, and the night was no longer a wall but a journey to be taken with a steady hand and a shielded flame. The experience of traversing the vast, silent distances of the pre-electric world by horse-drawn carriage was a journey into the very heart of the nocturnal void. As the sun dipped below the western horizon and the familiar landmarks of the day dissolved into the deep indigo shadows, the carriage became a small, fragile island of human presence moving through an ocean of absolute darkness. The journey began with the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of iron-rimmed wheels striking the uneven cobblestones or the soft, damp earth of the rural post roads, creating a repetitive cadence that matched the steady, heavy breathing of the team of horses pulling the weight of the vehicle inside the cabin. The passengers were enveloped in a world of tactile and auditory sensations, as the lack of visual detail forced the mind to focus on the swaying motion of the carriage, which felt like the gentle, rhythmic rolling of a boat on a calm, midnight sea. The only light available to the driver and the travelers was the meager, flickering radiance of two oil-fed lanterns mounted on either side of the box, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the sweating flanks of the horses and the low-hanging branches of the trees that lined the path. These small amber flames were the only defense against the pitch-black wilderness, creating a narrow, moving tunnel of visibility that barely extended beyond the heads of the lead horses, while the rest of the world remained lost in the heavy, velvety blue mist that settled in the valleys. The air outside was crisp and carried the sharp scent of damp earth, crushed grass, and the metallic aroma of the horse harnesses, filtering through the small, leather-curtained windows of the carriage. For the long-distance traveler, the night was not a time of cessation, but a period of suspended animation, where time was measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the distance between the remote coaching inns and the gradual shift of the constellations across the star-filled canopy. The silence of the countryside was profound, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves, the occasional creak of the leather springs, and the distant, melancholic howl of a wolf marking its territory in the dark. The driver, wrapped in heavy woolen cloaks and a leather hat, sat in a state of alert meditation, his eyes adapted to the subtle nuances of the dark, recognizing the turn of a road by the change in the wind or the reflection of the moon on a hidden stream. When the road passed through a dense forest, the darkness became even more absolute, with the canopy of leaves blocking out the silver light of the stars, leaving the carriage to move through a tunnel of pure shadow, where the only reality was the rhythmic pulse of the journey. Arriving at a remote post house in the middle of the night was a moment of surreal transition, as the sudden appearance of a single, glowing window or a flickering torch broke the spell of the isolation, providing a brief encounter with warmth and light before the journey continued back into the vast, indigo silence. This mode of travel fostered a deep sense of humility and presence, as the traveler was forced to surrender to the slow, steady pace of the animal world and the unforgiving cycles of the natural night. It was a time for deep reflection and for the quiet companionship of fellow travelers, their voices muffled by the heavy blankets and the steady roar of the wind against the wooden panels. The darkness was not a barrier, but a medium through which the soul traveled, connecting the isolated points of human civilization across the wide, silent expanse of the ancient world. The interior of the carriage smelled of aged cedar, old tobacco, and the lanolin of the heavy woolen rugs as the passengers huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the dim light of the lanterns filtering through the gaps in the door. Every bump in the road was a physical reminder of the earth's texture, a communication from the ground to the body, through the wooden frame of the vehicle. The horses themselves became ghosts of movement, their powerful muscles rippling under the indigo light, their ears twitching to catch sounds of the forest that the human ear could never perceive. They moved with an ancestral knowledge of the path, their hooves striking the ground in a perfect, unhurried unison that seemed to keep the world from spinning out of control. Sometimes, a fine layer of silver frost would begin to form on the glass of the window panes, refracting the moonlight into a soft, crystalline haze that blurred the edges of the reality outside. The driver would occasionally whisper a soft word of encouragement to the team, his voice low and grounding, a human thread in the vast, cosmic silence. The traveler would often fall into a state of biphasic consciousness, half dreaming and half awake, where the rhythmic swing of the carriage became a lullaby and the flickering light of the lantern became a star. This was the poetry of the pre-electric road, a world where the journey was as significant as the destination, and where the night was a vast cathedral of possibility and peace. As the wheels ground through the gravel of a mountain pass, the air grew colder, and the stars seemed to descend, their light appearing like silvery sparks in the navy blue sky. The absolute isolation of the high roads created a sense of being the only living beings in a universe of stone and mist. Every creak of the wood and every jingle of the harness was a heartbeat of civilization in the void, until finally, the first thin line of gold appeared on the distant horizon, slowly dissolving the deep blue velvet into the light of a new day, and the carriage would emerge from the shadows like a ship arriving at the shore, carrying its passengers through the history of the night. The transition of a royal palace into the domain of the night was a grand, meticulously orchestrated performance that began the moment the golden hues of the setting sun touched the highest stone battlements. In this era, the ability to push back the encroaching shadows on such a massive scale was the ultimate manifestation of sovereign power and material wealth. As the corridors grew dim, an army of silent servants specialized in the management of light would emerge from the hidden service passages carrying long, tapered poles tipped with small flames. They moved with a practiced rhythmic grace, igniting the hundreds of pure beeswax candles that filled the massive crystal chandeliers and silver sconces lining the endless galleries. Unlike the smoky, pungent tallow used in the homes of the common people, the palace air was filled with the subtle, clean aroma of high-quality wax, a scent that became synonymous with the presence of royalty. The visual experience was one of overwhelming, shimmering amber light reflecting off polished marble floors, gilded mirrors, and the intricate gold leaf of the ornate ceilings. However, despite this concentration of wealth and flame, the architectural vastness of the palace meant that the darkness was never fully vanquished. Instead, it was merely pushed into the corners and the heights. The soaring, vaulted ceilings remained lost in a deep navy blue void, where the light of the chandeliers could not reach, creating a world of dramatic high-contrast shadows that shifted and danced with every stray draft. As the night deepened, the public splendor of the ballrooms gave way to the quiet, echoing intimacy of the private apartments. The soundscape changed from the rhythmic rustling of heavy silk and the low murmur of courtiers to a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the steady, measured footsteps of the royal guards whose breastplates caught the faint, flickering light of the wall sconces. In the private chambers of the monarch, the lighting was significantly reduced to create a sanctuary of peace, favoring a few well-placed candles that cast long, soft shadows against the heavy velvet draperies. The ritual of the royal bedtime was conducted in this hallowed, low-light environment, where the boundaries between the physical world and the realm of dreams began to blur. Outside the thick stone walls, the palace gardens transformed into a landscape of silver and indigo, where the moon acted as the sole architect of visibility. The still waters of the fountains reflected the star-filled canopy like dark mirrors, and the manicured hedges became deep, impenetrable walls of shadow. The psychological weight of the night in a palace was one of both absolute security and a haunting sense of the infinite. The king was protected by stone and steel, yet he was as much a subject to the natural cycles of light and dark. Every candle that burned down was a silent measure of the passage of time, a golden thread in the tapestry of a dynasty. The coldness of the grand halls, even with the largest hearths, served as a constant reminder of the night's physical presence. The air in the galleries felt crisp and carried the faint scent of old stone and cold metal, filtering through the gaps in the heavy oak shutters. This era of royal night was a time of true stillness, where the mind could expand within the quietude of the shadows. The palace was not just a home, but a monument to humanity's desire to find order and beauty within the vast, indifferent darkness of the universe. When the final candle was eventually snuffed by the last watchman, the transition to the absolute dark was total and immediate, leaving the palace to sleep under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, until the first touch of dawn reclaimed the gilded towers. The architecture of the palace was designed to be viewed in the shifting, living light of the flame, where the textures of the stone and the richness of the fabrics were enhanced by the shadows. The presence of the night watchmen moving like ghosts through the galleries added a layer of rhythmic safety to the silence, their lanterns casting small, focused circles of light that moved like slow stars across the floors. Every floorboard that creaked and every curtain that swayed in the breeze was part of the palace's nocturnal breath, a living history that continued even when the residents were lost in the second sleep. The darkness here was not an enemy, but a stage upon which the grandeur of the monarchy was performed even in the absence of an audience. As the temperature dropped, the scent of beeswax would slowly fade, replaced by the metallic sharpness of the night air, creating a sensory journey that led the soul toward deep, meditative rest, in stark and somber contrast to the shimmering, abundant radiance that defined the evenings of the wealthy aristocracy. The experience of the night for the vast majority of the population was characterized by a profound and inescapable scarcity of artificial light. For poor families, agricultural laborers, and urban artisans, the setting of the sun brought an immediate and non-negotiable end to productive labor and surrendered the household to the heavy, enveloping embrace of the indigo shadows. The primary, and often the only source of light in their humble dwellings, was the open hearth, the beating heart of the home that provided essential warmth and the means for cooking, and around which the entire family would congregate as the darkness pressed against the cold stone or timber walls. A true candle, even one made of cheap, smelly animal fat known as tallow, was a precious luxury item that required a significant portion of the meager household budget, and therefore its use was managed with extreme frugality and cautious economy. To conserve these valued resources, many poor households relied on the humbler, more primitive alternative known as the rushlight. This makeshift illuminator was crafted by gathering the common rush from the marshes, peeling back the outer skin to reveal the pith, and then repeatedly dipping it into leftover kitchen grease or rendered bacon fat until it was saturated. The resulting rushlight provided only a fragile, erratic, and dim glow that was prone to heavy smoking and offered a pungent, salty aroma that filled the small, enclosed living spaces. To maximize the meagerness of this light, families were forced into a tight, shared proximity, huddling together on simple wooden stools or around the edges of a communal straw bed, creating a small circle of limited visibility while the rest of the room remained lost in a deep, velvety navy void. Every movement within this delicate light caused long, spectral shadows to stretch and shrink across the rough fume beams and earthen floors, transforming the interior into a dynamic, ever-shifting tapestry of amber and indigo. This scarcity of elevation meant that many complex or fine tasks, such as reading, writing, or intricate mending, were effectively impossible after twilight, reducing the evening to simple, stationary activities like oral storytelling, quiet meditation, or the preparation of a final, humble meal. There was a distinct sensory density to this pre-electric poverty, composed of the scent of wood smoke, drying herbs, and the heavy, oily odor of the burning grease, visually defined by a texture that flat, modern light cannot replicate. The end of the rushlight's brief life, or the extinguishing of the single candle, marked the final surrender to the absolute darkness of the nocturnal world, leaving the inhabitants to rely on their other senses and their deep, intimate knowledge of their cramped surroundings to navigate the hours until the second sleep. This intimate relationship with a singular, fragile source of light fostered a deep respect for the sun's return and a sense of collective stillness within the shared quietude of the home. Every flicker was a shared experience, a quiet testament to human resilience holding on to the light against the vast, encroaching silence of the ancient night. And the eventual rise of the first gray light of dawn on the eastern horizon was not just a signal for labor, but a welcomed release from the cold constraint of the indigo shadows. The transition from the world of secular labor to the hallowed, absolute silence of the medieval monastery was a profound shift in the human experience. A journey into a realm where the darkness was not a void to be feared, but a sacred canvas for spiritual discipline and contemplative labor. For the monks living within the thick, cold stone walls of the great European abbeys, The night was meticulously structured by the canonical hours, a rigorous schedule of prayer and meditation that transformed the pre-electric void into a sanctuary of rhythmic devotion. As the great bell of the cathedral or the abbey church rang out its deep, resonant call through the still night air, its vibration traveled like a physical wave across the frost-covered fields and through the heavy, indigo mist that settled in the valleys. This was the signal for vigils or matins, the first and most significant of the night offices, which typically occurred in the profound depths of the second sleep. Often around 2 or 3 in the morning, the monks would rise from their humble narrow straw pallets in the communal dormitory, moving like silent grey-clad ghosts through the unheated stone corridors, their heavy woolen habits, coarse and scratchy to the skin, provided the only meager defense against the bone-deep chill that radiated from the granite walls and the slate floors. Every footstep was a hollow echo in the vast, empty spaces, and every breath was visible as a delicate blue wisp in the dim, shifting light of the high, vaulted ceilings. The journey from the sleeping quarters to the choir stalls was a transition from the realm of the self to the collective service of the eternal. Inside the abbey church, the visual environment was one of extreme, high-contrast shadows and localized amber light. The only illumination came from a handful of pure beeswax candles, their steady, fragile flames struggling to push back the encroaching navy-blue darkness that occupied the upper reaches of the nave. These small fires cast long, dramatic shadows that danced across the intricate stone carvings of saints and the weathered surfaces of the wooden choir stalls. The monks took their positions in the dark, their eyes adapted to the subtle nuances of the gloom, recognizing their places by touch and by the familiar smell of aged cedar, old parchment, and the lingering sweet aroma of frankincense from the evening vespers. The soundscape of the night prayer was a delicate, hypnotic symphony of human breath, the soft rustling of vellum pages, and the occasional, sharp crackle of a guttering wick. When the first notes of the Gregorian chant rose into the stone void, the music filled the church with a slow, melodic unison that seemed to resonate within the very bones of the building. This chanting was a vocal shield against the absolute silence of the stars, a rhythmic declaration of human presence and purpose within the infinite void of the nocturnal world. The pace of the service was slow and deliberate, matching the heartbeat of a community that lived entirely in harmony with the celestial cycles. Between the psalms and the readings, periods of profound, heavy silence would descend upon the group, a time for deep, solitary meditation on the transient nature of existence and the majesty of the cosmos. During these intervals, the mind would expand within the visual deprivation, finding a unique clarity and peace that only the absolute dark can provide. The lack of artificial distraction allowed for a level of concentration that modern life has largely forgotten, making the night office the most intellectually and spiritually intense period of the day. For the medieval monk, the night was not a time of lost productivity, but the most productive time of all, a time for the forging of the soul within the hallowed quietude of the shadows. As the prayers reached their final lingering notes and the first grey, ethereal light of the dawn began to pierce the high, leaded glass windows, the monks would return to their studies or their simple labors in the scriptorium, carrying the stillness of the dark into the light of the coming day. This ancient rhythm of nocturnal worship was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a way of finding order, beauty, and meaning in a world that was often harsh, cold, and unpredictable. Every candle that burned down and every bell that rang through the indigo mist was a thread in the tapestry of a life lived in constant, patient dialogue with the darkness. The monastery was a monument to the endurance of faith and the power of the communal silence, a place where the pre-electric night was embraced as a gift of clarity and a gateway to the divine. The experience of the ancient mariner navigating the vast and trackless expanse of the open ocean under the absolute pre-electric night was a journey into the very heart of the cosmic void. For thousands of years, the safety of the crew and the success of the voyage depended entirely upon an intimate and spiritual connection with the celestial canopy. As the sun dipped beneath the watery horizon and the long indigo shadows merged into a single heavy veil of darkness, the wooden ship became a tiny and fragile island of human purpose adrift in an infinite sea of shadow. There was no artificial glow from distant shores and no electronic signals to guide the way, only the rhythmic and hypnotic sound of the hull slicing through the dark swells and the cold, salty spray that filled the midnight air. Navigation at night was a meticulous and meditative science performed in a state of deep sensory alert. The navigator would stand upon the pitching deck with eyes adapted to the subtle nuances of the gloom, recognizing the familiar constellations as they performed their slow and majestic procession across the star-filled vault. The North Star, or Polaris, served as the immovable anchor of the northern hemisphere, as a steady silver spark that provided a constant reference point for latitude, while the great river of the Milky Way arched from one horizon to the other, like a blazing pearlescent guide that illuminated the spray and the sails with a faint and ethereal light. To measure the angle of the stars, the mariner employed early instruments, like the crossstaff or the Nocturnal, which were simple tools made of wood and brass that required a steady hand and a patient mind in the swaying dark. Every measurement was a dialogue with the universe, and a way of anchoring the ship to the eternal rhythms of the cosmos. The soundscape of the nocturnal sea was profound and heavy, broken only by the creaking of the timber and the snap of the canvas in the wind, along with the distant melancholic roar of waves breaking on unseen reefs. This absolute isolation fostered a sense of profound humility and presence as the sailor realized that his life was bounded by forces far greater than his own agency. The olfactory experience was equally rich and composed of the scent of old wood and drying hemp ropes mixed with the sharp metallic aroma of the deep ocean air. During the nights of the new moon, when the sky was a velvet cloak of total obscurity, the mariner relied on his other senses by listening for the change in the waves or the sound of seabirds to detect the proximity of land. The ocean at night was not a barrier, but a medium through which the soul traveled to connect the isolated points of human civilization across the wide and silent expanse of the ancient world. The interior of the vessel was a sanctuary of dim visibility, lit only by the faint glow of a shielded oil lamp in the binnacle, which cast long and soft shadows against the charts and the compass. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, a sense of profound peace and safety would settle over the deck, as a feeling of being embraced by the natural world rather than struggling against it. The air felt clearer and the stars felt closer, while the long hours of the pre-electric nights offered a sanctuary for reflection and rest that has been lost in the constant brilliance of the modern age. The return of the first grey light of dawn was not just a signal for labor, but a welcomed release from the cold constraint of the indigo shadows. Every voyage was a testament to human resilience, holding on to the light against the vast and encroaching silence of the ancient night. And the sailor was a silent guardian and a calendar of the sea, a faithful companion of humanity through the long pre-electric centuries. Navigation was a ritual of transition, guiding the listeners from the high alert state of the day into the calm and receptive state required for the first sleep. The pace of the journey was slow and deliberate, to match the heartbeat of a community that lived entirely in harmony with the celestial cycles. Every wave was a potential story, and every flicker of a star was a precious resource to be used with care as the ship moved through the mist. The navigator felt like he was holding a piece of the sun in his mind as a warm and reliable friend in a world of cold indigo and deep navy. This was the reality of the sea for the vast majority of history, a time of quietude and connection to the natural order of the cosmos. The concept of the night garden in the pre-electric world was a sophisticated and sensory expression of humanity's deep connection to the nocturnal environment, providing a sanctuary of fragrance and silver light that was intended to be experienced long after the vibrant colors of the day had faded into the indigo shadows. For thousands of years in the grand estates of ancient Persia, the moonlit courtyards of the Roman Empire, and the serene temple grounds of Eastern Asia, gardens were meticulously designed not just for visual beauty under the sun, but for the profound and meditative atmosphere they offered under the stars. These moon gardens were curated with a specific palette of flora that revealed their true essence only in the presence of the lunar cycle, favoring white and pale-colored blossoms that acted as natural lanterns, catching and reflecting the meager silver light of the moon to create a ghostly, luminous glow amid the deep navy foliage. Jasmine, gardenias, and white lilies were chosen not only for their reflective properties but for their intoxicating and heavy scents that became significantly more potent as the air cooled and the world settled into the silence of the first sleep. The olfactory experience was the primary guide through these shadowy landscapes, as the absence of light allowed the human senses to sharpen and detect subtle nuances of jasmine-infused breezes and the earthy aroma of damp stone. The architecture of the night garden was centered around the presence of water, which served as a dark mirror for the celestial canopy. Still ponds, narrow channels, and bubbling fountains were positioned to capture the reflection of the moon and stars, creating a dynamic and fluid light that danced across the garden walls and the underside of tree canopies. The sound of water was a constant and grounding rhythm, providing a soothing acoustic backdrop that masked the distant sounds of the nocturnal wilderness and fostered a sense of profound interior peace. Pot systems were often constructed of light-colored pebbles or pale marble, providing a clear and visible route through the darkness without the need for artificial illumination. Walking through these gardens was a slow and deliberate act of meditation, where every step was a conscious engagement with the textures of the earth and the cool temperature of the night air. The boundaries between the cultivated garden and the wild, untamed night were often blurred by the presence of thick, blue mist that rolled over the hedges and settled in the low-lying hollows, creating a sense of being in a dreamlike, suspended reality. The psychology of the night garden was one of deep introspection and sensory withdrawal, a place where the soul could expand within the quietude of the shadows and find a unique clarity that only the absolute dark can provide. For the scholar or the philosopher, the night garden was a hallowed space for reflection on the transient nature of existence and the majesty of the cosmos, a place where the busy noises of the world were stilled and the mind could wander as far as the stars. The presence of night-blooming flowers, such as the evening primrose or the queen of the night, added a layer of mystery and wonder to the landscape. As their petals unfurled slowly in the silence, releasing their fragrant offerings to the nocturnal insects that move like shadows through the air, every creak of a branch and every ripple on the water was amplified by the vastness of the garden void, until the world felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the first touch of dawn to break the spell of the indigo shadows. The night garden was not just a collection of plants, but a monument to humanity's desire to find order and beauty within the vast, indifferent darkness of the universe. It was a sanctuary of the second sleep, where the mind could rest in harmony with the natural cycles of the earth and the stars. The preservation of these spaces was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a way of finding peace and meaning in the shadows. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, the scent of the flowers would slowly fade, replaced by the metallic sharpness of the night air, creating a sensory journey that led the soul toward a deep, meditative rest. Every leaf and every stone held a potential story in the shifting lights, and every flicker of the moon was a precious resource to be used with care. This ancient relationship with the night garden fostered a sense of wonder and humility that has been obscured by the constant brilliance of the modern age. providing a map through the long, silent hours of history and ensuring that the light of beauty was never truly extinguished by the dark. As the traveler moved through the mist, the garden felt like a piece of the cosmos held in the hand, a warm and reliable friend in a world of cold indigo and deep navy. The texture of the stone and the richness of the foliage were enhanced by the shadows, where the mind could find its own path to the light, providing a profound sense of tranquility. The ancient natural world, long before the imposition of Yape illumination, possessed a profound and perfectly balanced ecosystem that was governed entirely by the unforgiving, yet predictable, cycles of the sun and the moon. When the last rays of daylight vanished beyond the western edge of the earth, the vast majority of diurnal creatures entered a state of necessary stasis, surrendering the landscape to the domain of the nocturnal specialist. This great shift was not an abrupt, chaotic change, but a slow, majestic transition performed in near total silence, allowing the world to breathe and the environment to settle into a deep, meditative stillness that modern artificial brilliance has utterly silenced. For the creatures adapted to the absolute darkness of the pre-electric world, the night was not a void, but a dense, sensory-rich landscape teeming with information. Predators like the great horned owl became the silent masters of the indigo sky, their eyes possessing a specialized density of rod cells that could amplify the faint silver moonlight reflecting off the dewy grass or the damp earth, and their feathers engineered for silent flight, moving through the cool night air without a sound, creating a realm where the hunter was invisible until the moment of contact. The forest floor, lost in a velvety blackness, was alive with the unseen activity of rodents, foxes, and badgers, navigating complex trails not by sight but by an acute sense of smell and the delicate, subtle vibrations carried through the soil. The air itself was filled with the original music of the natural world, a complex, hypnotic symphony composed of the rhythmic, almost vibrational chirping of countless insects, the soft, leathery flap of bat wings navigating by echolocation, and the occasional, melancholic cry of a wolf or a coyote calling to its pack across a silent valley. These sounds were amplified by the surrounding absence of industrial noise, becoming the characteristic lullaby of a pre-electric history. Eyes that could not see became finely tuned to the rustle of dry leaves or the snap of a twig. Every sensory input loaded with the weight of survival. There was a profound balance in this raw, untouched environment. A delicate coexistence where the hunter and the hunted moved through the same indigo mists in a dance governed by instinct and adaptation. The olfactory experience was equally dense, composed of the scent of damp earth, drying wild herbs, and the heavy musk of animal territories drifting through the cool air. Humans living in harmony with this rhythm understood that the sounds of the nocturnal world were a measure of the environment's health and the signal for their own safety. Hearing the silent approach of a large cat or the rhythmic, territorial hooting of an owl provided a crucial connection to the wildness pressing against the cottage walls. It was a time when the human species felt like a participant in the great natural drama, holding on to the safety of the heart while the wild world reclaimed its rightful place under the stars. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, a sense of profound peace and shared stasis would settle over the wilderness, a collective acceptance of the natural order that allowed for a deep, restorative repose, until the very first gray light of dawn broke on the eastern horizon, signaling the time for the nocturnal specialist to retreat and for the diurnal world to awaken. This ancient relationship between animal behavior and the pre-electric night offered a sanctuary of rhythm and connection, a way of finding peace in the presence of the wild that has been largely lost in the constant brilliance of the modern age. The dense blue mist that rolled through the forests acted as a natural acoustic shield, further softening the sounds of movement and creating an atmosphere of suspended reality, where time itself seemed to slow down and wait for the sun. Every shadow held the potential story of survival, and every hoot or howl was a thread in the tapestry of a life lived in constant, patient dialogue with the darkness. It was a time of true stillness and profound respect for the balance of nature. Governed by the eternal, cold guardian of the stars, the human mind, in the absolute absence of light, is a vast and fertile ground for the birth of myth and legend. For thousands of years, the pre-electric night was not merely a physical state, but a profound psychological medium where the boundaries between the known and the imagined became fluid. As the sun dipped beneath the western edge of the world, and the long indigo shadows grew heavy over the landscape, the familiar geography of the day was replaced by a world of shifting silhouettes and whispering winds. It was in this profound silence and visual deprivation that the earliest folklore took root, providing a narrative structure to the primal fear of the unknown and the respect for the void. The origins of dark folklore were deeply tied to the survival instincts of our ancestors, who learned to perceive presence in every snap of a twig or rustle of a leaf in the nocturnal forest. This heightened state of sensory alert, combined with the brain's natural tendency to find patterns in the chaos of shadows, gave rise to the spirits and monsters that populated the collective imagination. Every shadow cast by a flickering hearth fire or the faint silver light of a distant moon became a potential entity, a guardian or a warning of things that moved in the velvet blackness. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees, but a living, breathing assembly of ancient watchers that required respect, ritual, and caution. Mythology was the human way of organizing the vast, indifferent void, turning the terrifying silence into stories that could be managed and passed down through the generations across different cultures. The themes of these dark tales shared a common thread of caution and reverence for the natural order. The mysterious lights in the marshes, the dwellers of the deep woods, and the shadow spirits of the mountain passes were all expressions of a shared human experience of the absolute dark. These narratives were not intended to entertain but to protect, serving as oral maps for the nocturnal world and establishing the protocols for safety during the hours of the second sleep. The darkness was a sacred theater where the ancestors spoke through the wind and where the consequences of daily life were reflected in the heavy dreams of the night. Rituals of protection, such as the hanging of herbs, the lighting of a candle, or the rhythmic chanting of a prayer, were the physical manifestations of this deep psychological bond with the shadows. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, the storytelling circle around the dying embers of the hearth became a sanctuary of shared meaning, where the human voice stood as a steady defiance against the infinite, star-filled void. This era of pre-electric folklore fostered a sense of profound humility and interconnectedness with the natural world, recognizing that humanity was but a small part of a larger, more mysterious reality. The darkness acted as a mirror for the soul, revealing the deepest fears and the highest hopes of a species that lived in dialogue with the unknown. As the constellations performed their majestic and slow procession across the navy blue vault, the myths provided a sense of temporal order, anchoring the individual to the ancestral past and the celestial future. The absolute silence of the night allowed the mind to expand and explore the imagination, where the monsters of the dark were often reflections of the internal struggles of the heart. This rich tapestry of belief was the original foundation of human culture, a way of finding beauty in the shadows that modern artificial light has largely erased. Every creak of the floorboard and every rattle of the shutter was a potential line in a story, a communication from the unseen world to the living, until the first grey light of dawn broke the spell of the indigo night, reclaiming the world of visible facts and returning the spirits to their resting places. The folklore of the dark was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a way of holding on to meaning even when the sun was far below. The darkness was not a void, but a reservoir of wisdom, waiting for those with the patience to listen to the whispers of the ancient word in the hallowed quietude of the shadows. It was a time when the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were thin, and the world felt larger than it ever would in the glare of the electric day. As the cold air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp stone, the mind would settle into a state of peace, knowing that stories held the fabric of the community together in the face of the eternal night. The experience of dreaming in the deep, silent centuries before the constant hum of electricity, was a profound journey into the very architecture of the human soul and the vast, uncharted territories of the subconscious mind. As the sun surrendered the sky to the immense navy blue vault of the stars, and the world settled into the heavy, indigo quietude of the first sleep, the boundaries of the mind began to expand within the absolute darkness of the pre-electric night. For the ancient and medieval mind, dreams were not merely random biological flickers or fragments of memory, but were perceived as a vital and sacred bridge between the physical material world and the higher, more mysterious spiritual reality. This deeply rooted belief system transformed the long, silent hours of the night into a hallowed space for communication with the divine, the ancestral, and the infinite. Throughout human history, different cultures developed complex and reverent theories to explain the vivid landscapes of the mind that emerged only in the absence of light. In the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, dreams were viewed as literal portals through which the gods or the spirits of the deceased delivered essential messages, warnings, or prophecies to the waking world. The dreamer was seen as a passive but necessary vessel for these celestial communications, and the interpretation of these nocturnal visions was a respected science conducted by specialized priests in the quiet, shadow-filled halls of the temples. In ancient Greece, the practice of dream incubation in the sanctuaries of Asclepius involved a deliberate and ritualized preparation for the night, where the seeker would sleep in a sacred space, wrapped in the silence of the temple, specifically to receive a healing dream or a solution to a problem from the gods. This process was conducted in near total darkness, fostering a state of deep, meditative receptivity that the modern world with its constant artificial stimulation has almost entirely forgotten. The psychology of the pre-electric dreamer was one of profound presence and humility, as the lack of visual distraction allowed the mind to produce images of incredible clarity and sensory depth. The transition between the first sleep and the second sleep was often the most fertile ground for these visions, a time when the brain was suspended between the heavy rest of the early evening and the alert stillness of the midnight watch. During this quiet interval, people would reflect on the dreams they had just experienced, treating them as tangible artifacts of their internal life that required contemplation and respect. In the medieval world, dreams were often categorized into different types ranging from the somnium, which required complex interpretation, to the visio, which was believed to be a direct and literal vision of a future event. These beliefs created a sense of continuity between the day and the night, where the events of the waking world were seen as only one part of a larger and more mysterious journey of the soul. The olfactory environment of the ancient bedroom, with its sense of damp wool, wood smoke, and drying herbs, often influenced the texture and the narrative of the dreams themselves, weaving the physical reality of the home into the fabric of the subconscious. The absence of light allowed the eyes to rest and the inner vision to sharpen, creating a dream world where colors were often more vibrant and the emotions more intense than the shades of the indigo world outside. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, the human spirit would find a unique kind of solace in these internal landscapes, finding meaning, order, and beauty in the shadows. The dream was a sanctuary of possibility in a world that was often harsh and physically demanding, a place where the soul could travel as far as the stars and converse with the echoes of the past without the constraints of time or space. This ancient relationship with the subconscious was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a way of finding hope and wisdom in the vast, encroaching silence of the pre-electric night, Every dream was a story. Every vision was a thread in the tapestry of a life lived in constant, patient dialogue with the darkness. Until the first grey light of dawn broke the spell of the indigo night and returned the dreamer to the world of visible facts. The pre-electric night was a vast cathedral of dreaming, where the silence was a teacher and the darkness was a faithful guide to the deeper mysteries of existence. It was a time of true stillness and profound respect for the balance of nature, governed by the eternal, cold guardian of the stars. And as each generation added its own layers to the ancestral tales, the night became a reservoir of wisdom. The communal bonfire served as the grandest and most primitive manifestation of human defiance against the absolute darkness of the pre-electric world, representing a monumental and radiant beacon that unified the fragmented groups of ancient and medieval society within the vast, silent, and often intimidating expanse of the nocturnal landscape. These colossal fires were far more than mere sources of physical warmth or tools for practical survival. They were central social and ritualistic anchors that transformed the deep indigo void of the evening into a temporary theater of shimmering amber light and shared communal experience. As the sun surrendered the western horizon to the immense, navy blue vault of the stars and the long shadows of the ancient forests grew heavy and impenetrable, the construction of the bonfire would begin with a meticulous and rhythmic layering of seasoned hardwood, resinous pine, and dry brushwood, creating a dense and imposing structure that promised both a persistent longevity and a fierce rhythmic radiance throughout the long, cold hours of the deep night. The act of igniting the central flame was often a solemn and communal ritual performed in the hallowed silence of the twilight, marking the profound transition from the individual isolation of the domestic home to the collective gathering of the tribe, village, or town. The visual impact of a massive bonfire in a world otherwise swallowed by a velvety and heavy blackness was truly staggering, as the orange and amber sparks leaped and swirled toward the distant stars like a shower of fallen constellations, creating a dynamic and living column of heat that seemed to physically connect the damp earth to the celestial canopy above. The light from the fire did not merely illuminate the immediate ground but reached deep into the surrounding wilderness or across the open, misty plains, casting long, erratic, and spectral shadows of the gathered people and the distant, ancient trees that danced in a hypnotic and silent unison against the curtain of the night. The sensory experience of the bonfire was a powerful and constant combination of intense, radiating heat on the face and the biting, crisp chill of the midnight air on the back, creating a localized environment of vibrant and comforting energy within the vast and indifferent void of the ancient world. The soundscape was dominated by the rhythmic crackle, hiss, and roar of the burning wood, a deep and vibrational music that provided a vital acoustic shield against the unpredictable and often unsettling sounds of the nocturnal wilderness. The aroma of burning resin, wood smoke, and sometimes toasted grain or wild herbs filled the still, heavy air, depositing a fine and lingering layer of scent on the clothing, skin, and hair of those huddled near the life-giving flames. These gatherings were the primary venues for seasonal celebrations, the marking of the solstices, and the reinforcement of social bonds through shared stories, quiet meditation, and the rhythmic movement of a community in harmony with the natural order. The fire acted as a natural and intuitive clock for the evening. With the gradual collapse of the glowing timber and the slow cooling of the charcoal signaling the time for the eventual retreat to the first sleep, the psychology of the bonfire was one of profound safety and spiritual expansion, a rare and cherished moment when the boundaries of the human world were pushed far beyond the domestic threshold, allowing for a sense of freedom and belonging that was impossible in the restrictive and dangerous dark of the daily routine. As the night deepened and the fire began its slow and patient transition to a dull, pulsing red glow, the participants would experience a profound state of stillness and presence, as if the entire world were holding its breath under the cold and watchful eye of the moon. This ancient tradition of the communal flame was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, a way of finding hope, continuity, and meaning in the face of the infinite and encroaching darkness of the pre-electric night. Every spark was a silent narrative, and every flickering shadow was a memory of a shared history lived in absolute harmony with the natural cycles of the sun, the stars, and the seasons. The bonfire was the original town square, the original sacred space, and the original sanctuary, a place where the light of humanity stood in defiant and quiet beauty against the absolute silence of the ancient night, providing a map of warmth and light through the long, indigo hours of history. And as the first gray light of the dawn eventually reclaimed the eastern horizon, the site of the fire remained a hallowed and respected place, the cooling charcoal and the light gray ash serving as silent, enduring witnesses to the night's communal survival and the triumph of the collective spirit over the void. The textures of the charred wood and the smell of the cold embers would linger in the morning air, a sensory reminder of the fire's former glory. Every community held the memory of these fires as a sacred trust, ensuring that the flame of connection was never truly extinguished by the shadows of the past. This was the heartbeat of the pre-electric community, a rhythmic pulse of light that kept the silence from becoming too heavy and the dark from becoming too lonely. The rhythmic, pre-electric night was defined by a specific and natural pattern of rest known as biphasic or segmented sleep, a deep, ancient rhythm of slumber that modern humanity has largely forgotten under the persistent glare of the artificial day. For thousands of years, as the sun surrendered to the immense navy blue vault of the stars marked the final end of productive labor, human communities did not retreat to a single, uninterrupted block of slumber. Instead, they surrendered to the first sleep, a deep, heavy rest that typically lasted 3 to 4 hours after twilight, a period of profound physical reclamation governed by the cool, silent hours of the early evening. Then, often around midnight or 1 in the morning, a natural rhythmic awakening would occur, a period of focused yet relaxed alertness known in many folk traditions as the dormante or the waking interval. This was a hallowed, private space within the absolute darkness of the nocturnal void, lasting an hour or two. It was not a time of restlessness or anxiety, but a cherished interlude for contemplation, quiet conversation between couples, intimate prayer, or the pursuit of simple, solitary tasks by the meager light of a single tallow candle or the pulsing embers of the banked hearth. During this quiet interval, the brain was in a unique state of calm focus, fostering deep meditation and a sense of profound spiritual connection that modern continuous sleep cannot replicate. The textures of the pre-electric room, composed of damp wool, dry straw, and aged timber, became sensory anchors in the silence, visually defined by a limited, warm amber pool of light that struggled to penetrate the vast, enveloping indigo mist that pressed against the walls. For the scholar, the dormante was a precious window for the slow and meticulous reading of a treasured manuscript, where every word held a weight and meaning that is often lost in the noisy haste of the modern day. For others, it was a time for visiting neighbors in small villages, moving through the pitch-black streets with a shielded lantern, fostering a unique sense of communal safety and solidarity within the shared void. As this waking interval eventually reached its natural conclusion, the human spirit would find its way back into the second sleep, a different kind of slumber that often lasted until the first gray light of the dawn began to reclaim the eastern horizon, a lighter and more restorative phase of rest, often populated by vivid dreams and visions. The two sleeps were as distinct as the tides, the first being heavy and physical, the second being light and intuitive. The end of this ancient biphasic rhythm came not by choice but by coercion. driven by the rigorous demands of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent arrival of the relentless electric light bulb, which merged the natural segments of the pre-electric night into a single, condensed period of sleep optimized for the waking clock of commerce. Yet, even today, the memory of this segmented rest lingers in the nocturnal void, a testament to a time when human presence stood in defiant and quiet beauty against the absolute silence of the ancient night, a map of warmth and light through the long, indigo hours of history, and as the first thin line of gold slowly dissolved the deep blue velvet into the light, the site of the two sleeps remained a hallowed place, a sanctuary of rhythm and connection. Every flicker was a shared experience, a quiet testament to human resilience holding on to the light against the vast encroaching silence of the ancient night. This was the urban night for thousands of years, a world of shadows and secrets where the light of a single candle was a beacon of hope against the vast encroaching silence of the stone city within the extended period of darkness. Right alongside the peaceful rest offered by the biphasic sleep rhythm, the absolute darkness of the pre-electric city was also nurturing a dynamic and dangerous ecosystem dominated by shadow and silence. For those pursuing illegal business, smugglers, and thieves, the unlit streets were not an obstacle. On the contrary, they were a powerful ally where human presence could only be detected by sound or smell, reducing the complex geometry of the city to a single, impenetrable plane of gray and black. Moving through these pitch-black corridors required a sensory adaptation that modern humans can scarcely imagine, where the faint sound of a wool coat brushing against a rough wooden beam or the crunch of gravel under a heavy leather boot could determine the difference between survival and capture. Illicit trade was coming alive in this void. Smugglers, while transporting contraband from misty riverbanks to secret cellars, were using a complex and silent code system emanating from protected lanterns. The psychology of the urban night was a state of deep paranoia and localized terror, because every deeply shadowed doorway was becoming a potential ambush point where the eye could find no purchase. To counter this, a parallel economy based on protection emerged. Link boys, young workers carrying a dynamic and smoky torch made of pitch and resin for wealthy travelers, by casting long, dancing shadows that made familiar streets look alien and monstrous, were providing a small, localized balloon of light and relative safety. The running footsteps echoing against the stone walls of narrow alleys were usually followed by a deep, physical silence formed by the darkness completely swallowing the event. Locks and keys became massive and intricate, forged from crude iron to serve as the ultimate defense against the unseen threat. Every hinge creak was amplified by the vastness of the urban void. This was the urban night for thousands of years, a realm where order was a fragile structure clinging to a single candle flame against the vast, encroaching silence of the stone city. The silence of the pre-electric night was not merely the absence of sound, but a profound and physical presence that shaped the very perception of reality. A silence so dense and heavy it could be felt as a cool weight pressing against the skin, far from the relentless, vibrational drone of modern infrastructure. The natural night settled into a hallowed quietude, allowing the soul to breathe in harmony with the cosmos. This was a stillness not of death but of suspended life, a meditative pause where the mind could expand within the indigo void. In this absolute quiet, every minute sound was loaded with meaning and amplified by the vastness of the darkness. The soft, rhythmic collapse of a banked hearth fire, the subtle hiss of a burning oil wick, the rustle of straw bedding, these were the characteristic sounds of existence. The perception of time itself became fluid, measured not by mechanical clocks but by the slow rotation of the star-filled canopy above and the patient respiration of the natural world. People developed a different language of listening, distinguishing the distinct sounds of different winds, the specific calls of different nocturnal predators, the subtle changes in the texture of the snow-covered ground. This was the original acoustic sanctuary, where humanity found connection to the primal forces that governed the universe. The silence allowed for the oral traditions to take root, for history to be passed down in whispers that resonated deeper than any shout. Every creak of the ancient timber and every rattle of the iron latch was part of the night's own breath, until the first grey light of the dawn eventually claimed the silence, returning the world to the noisy business of the sun. It was a time of deep listening and profound presence, where the human voice stood in defiant and quiet beauty against the vast, indifferent silence of the ancient night, a map of warmth and stillness through the long, indigo hours of history. The final hour of the indigo night possessed its own unique, breathless tension, a period when the absolute stillness of the second sleep began to soften as the celestial clock wound toward the morning. For thousands of years, this daily transition from the profound silence of the stars to the noisy business of the sun was a shared ritual of rebirth. It began not with lights, but with a subtle shift in the temperature of the air, a crispness that seeped into the stone walls and timber frames as the cool blue mist of the valleys began to lift and swirl in anticipation of the light. Inside the simple cottages and great palaces alike, the pulsing red embers of the bank hearths would be gently stirred back to life, their soft amber glow providing the first localized warmth against the residual cold. The first auditory signs of the dawn were delicate and precise. The solitary, melancholic call of a waking bird, the distant, resonant chime of an abbey bell marking the arrival of lauds, the rhythmic creak of a heavy oak door as the first watchmen returned from their solitary rounds. The human body, accustomed to the biphasic rhythm, would experience a final, restorative transition, shaking off the heaviness of the nocturnal void. This was the moment of surrender, where the rule of the shadows was broken by a thin, ethereal line of pale gold that appeared on the eastern horizon, dissolving the deep velvet indigo into a soft, charcoal gray. Shutters that had been barred for security would be thrown open, allowing the first fresh breath of the morning to filter through the rooms. The unlocking of the city gates and the heavy click of the iron latches signaled the reopening of the world. A profound sense of gratitude and relief accompanied every dawn, a recognition that the dangers and mysteries of the shadows had once again been held at bay. The texture of the stone walls and the smell of the damp earth became familiar landmarks once more, returning the soul from the vastness of the cosmos to the tangible reality of human labor. This was the heartbeat of the pre-electric community, a cyclic defiance of the void, holding on to the light against the vast encroaching silence. The transition was complete, and the night was surrendered until the sun performed its inevitable surrender to the indigo shadows once more.